The first time I really noticed Matto was one of those blistering afternoons when the sun hung like an oppressive weight in the sky. I had been standing at the door, a glass of iced tea cooling in my hand, watching him work in the flower bed by the porch. He was different from the other gardeners who had come and gone over the years. Young, probably in his late 20s, with tan skin that gleamed under the harsh sunlight, his dark hair tousled by the breeze. His hands moved with a practiced precision, pulling weeds and pressing down the soil with such ease it seemed like second nature to him. Something about that moment pulled me outside. Perhaps it was the oppressive heat, or maybe the fading laughter of the children riding their bikes to the park, leaving behind a silence I couldn't shake. Or maybe it was the simple, undeniable pull of curiosity. "Hot day to be out here," I called, stepping down from the porch, offering him the glass of iced tea. He looked up then, his eyes locking with mine for the first time, deep brown, warm, and filled with a quiet intensity that made my heart flutter in my chest. His gaze lingered for a fraction longer than necessary before he stood, brushing dirt from his hands. "Gracias," he said, his voice low, smooth, with a subtle accent. I nodded, suddenly self-conscious, as if I hadn't expected him to speak at all. I could feel the heat in my cheeks as I stood there in my casual shorts and tank top. "You've done a great job with the yard," I added, gesturing to the meticulously cared-for plants around us. "It hasn't looked this good in years." He gave a small, genuine smile, a curve of his lips that tugged at something deep inside me. "It's a beautiful garden," he said. "Just needed a little care." We spoke for a few more minutes. Nothing extraordinary, just the polite exchanges between a homeowner and the person tending their lawn. But there was something in the way he listened, the way his eyes held mine a beat too long, that made me feel like I was the only person in the world. When he handed the empty glass back to me and returned to his work, I walked back inside, my heart racing in a way I couldn't quite understand. Over the following weeks, I found myself making excuses to be outside whenever Matto was around. I'd water the plants on the porch or pretend to tidy the garage, anything to steal glances of him as he worked. He didn't seem to mind my presence. In fact, I think he welcomed it. Our conversations grew longer, moving past polite pleasantries into more personal territory. His family in Mexico, his dreams of starting his own landscaping business, and even my frustrations with the monotony of suburban life. "Doesn't your husband help with the garden?" he asked one afternoon, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. I laughed, a short, bitter sound that surprised even me. "Greg," I said. "He barely notices it exists." Mateo frowned, as though trying to understand a puzzle that didn't quite make sense to him. "That's a shame," he said quietly. "You deserve someone who notices." His words took me by surprise, and for a moment I stood there, unsure how to respond. I could feel a blush creeping up my neck, and I turned away, busily adjusting the hose as a way to collect myself. By the time I looked back, he was trimming the hedges, his focus entirely on his work as though nothing had happened. But I knew it had. We both knew it. The following week, I told myself I would keep my distance. Whatever this strange, unspoken energy between us was, it wasn't something I could afford to entertain. Greg might not be attentive, but he wasn't oblivious. And if the kids noticed anything, they would start asking questions. Still, when Thursday came, I found myself peering through the window, watching as Mateo's truck pulled into the driveway. He hopped out, tools in hand, his confident movements as familiar to me now as my own reflection. I busied myself in the kitchen, wiping down counters that were already spotless, the hum of his mower in the background. An hour passed before I realized I had forgotten to move the patio furniture out of his way. Cursing softly under my breath, I grabbed my sandals and headed outside. Mateo was by the side garden, adjusting the sprinkler system. "I meant to move the chairs for you," I called out, my voice too loud in the quiet afternoon. "I'm sorry, I completely forgot." He straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "No problem," he said, smiling. "I can handle it." "No, it's fine," I insisted, walking toward the deck. I've got it. Mateo followed me, his presence behind me like a shadow I couldn't escape. As I bent down to lift one of the chairs, he stepped forward to grab the same one. Our hands brushed and my heart skipped. I froze, pulse quickening, as the proximity between us became too much to ignore. "Let me," he said, his voice close, too close. I stepped back, letting go of the chair, and he moved it with effortless strength. I should have walked away then, retreated back inside before whatever this was could spiral out of control. But I didn't. Instead, I stood there, lingering as he finished arranging the furniture. "You didn't have to do all this," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned to face me, his eyes locking onto mine with such intensity that I felt rooted to the spot. "I don't mind," he said simply. "You shouldn't have to do everything yourself." There was again the simple acknowledgement that Greg hadn't offered in years. It was dangerous, intoxicating, and I couldn't seem to let it go. "I should probably get back inside," I stammered, turning toward the doorframe, my hand resting on the cool wood. But then he spoke, his tone gentle yet firm, and I froze. "Wait," Matto said, his voice soft, but the weight behind it made me hesitate. I hesitated, torn between the desire to escape and something else, something that kept me rooted in place. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he continued, taking a step closer, his presence undeniable. "If I've overstepped—" "No, I didn't mean—" I trailed off, my words tumbling out faster than I could collect them. We stood in silence, the air between us thick with unspoken things. The sun, beginning to set, bathed the yard in a golden glow, casting long shadows over everything. His face was partly in the shade, but his eyes were clear, searching, focused, searching mine for something I wasn't sure I could offer. "I should go," he said finally, his voice tinged with regret. I nodded, stepping aside, allowing him to pass. As he walked away, something sharp twisted in my chest, something I couldn't name. Was it relief, or something else, something darker, more intense? Longing, maybe. I couldn't quite tell. The next morning, I stepped out onto the porch and froze. There, lying on the small table beside the door, was a single flower, a vibrant red hibiscus, freshly cut and placed with careful intention. It was impossible to miss. I didn't tell Greg, and the kids didn't seem to notice, but every time I stepped onto the porch, my gaze inevitably fell to that spot, the place where the flower had been, and I couldn't stop imagining Mateo's hands, careful and deliberate, placing it there, knowing it would be waiting for me. The flower haunted me for days. When Thursday arrived again, I tried to convince myself it would be just another day. I told myself to keep busy, to stay inside, to let him do his work without any interruptions. But as the afternoon wore on, I found myself again sitting on the porch steps, iced tea in hand. Matto was at the far end of the yard, trimming the overgrown hedges near the fence. The sound of the clippers was rhythmic, almost soothing, and I found myself watching him, his movements deliberate and precise, the way he worked with such care. Finally, he noticed me. He straightened, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, and hesitated for a moment before making his way over. The clippers hung loosely in his hand. "You've been hiding from me," he said, his voice low and teasing, the corners of his mouth curling into a smile. "I haven't," I replied quickly, though even as I spoke the words they felt false. He chuckled, setting the clippers down and leaning against the porch railing. "Did you like the flower?" he asked, his eyes narrowing in the soft afternoon light. I glanced down at my glass, swirling the ice cubes as they clinked softly. It was beautiful, I admitted, my voice quieter than I intended. His smile faded, replaced by a seriousness that made my pulse quicken. "You deserve beautiful things," he said, his words carrying a weight that hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. I should have said something, anything, to break the spell we were both caught in, but instead, I stayed silent, my gaze fixed on the condensation forming on my glass, unwilling to meet his eyes. I don't want to cause trouble for you, Moo," he continued, his voice softer now. "You're not," I said quickly, my words tumbling out in a rush. I finally looked up at him, our gazes locking. For a fleeting moment, the world outside seemed to fade. The sound of kids playing down the street, the hum of the neighbor's lawnmower, even the faint buzz of cicadas, they all disappeared, leaving only the two of us, caught in the amber glow of the late afternoon. "You make me feel seen," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop them. His expression softened, and he took a small step closer. "You are seen," he said, his voice low but certain. I felt a lump rise in my throat, a mix of longing and guilt that threatened to overwhelm me. This can't happen, I thought, my mind racing, but I couldn't bring myself to say it aloud. "I know," he said, his voice thick with understanding and regret. We stood there, so close now that I could feel the heat radiating from his body, the scent of sweat and fresh grass hanging in air between us. The space between us was small, yet insurmountable. His hand hovered near mine, so close I could feel the warmth of his skin, but not quite touching. For one electrifying moment, the world seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. But just as quickly, the moment slipped away. Maddow stepped back, his eyes lingering on mine for one last heartbeat before he turned and walked away. I watched him go, my heart pounding in my chest, the urge to call him back almost overwhelming. The clippers clinked softly as he resumed his work, the rhythmic sound of the blades a sharp reminder of the line we hadn't crossed, but had come far too close to. That evening, after he left, I stayed on the porch long after his truck had disappeared down the street. The sky had shifted from gold to deep indigo, the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Inside, Greg was watching TV, oblivious to the storm that had quietly gathered just outside our door.